My name is Helen Carter. I am 64 years old. I worked for more than 4 decades as a bookkeeper at a small construction company in Ohio. Numbers kept me steady. They gave me order when life at home was often chaotic. I am a widow, and for many years I believed my only purpose was to raise my 2 sons, Daniel and Mark. Every choice I made, every sacrifice, circled back to them. But tonight, as I lay in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms and machines beeping beside me, I realized something that cut deeper than any scalpel. My sons chose a seat in the bleachers, overstanding by their mother's bed. That is not a metaphor. Those are the exact words I heard, half conscious, when the doctor called them. The doctor's voice trembled as he explained, "Your mother may not survive tonight." And my oldest, Daniel, answered without hesitation, "We can't leave." "We're at the ball game." Mark echoed him in the background, his voice casual, almost laughing. That single sentence tore through the haze of painkillers and monitors. It hit me harder than the heart attack that had dragged me into the ICU in the first place. I was rushed to the hospital unconscious. The doctors tried their best. They called my sons, but they replied, "We can't. We're at the ball game." Even after being told, tonight might be her last, they never came. A week later, they finally showed up. But my bed was empty, and on it, only a single note remained. The moment they read it, the color drained from their faces. That is where this story begins. Before I take you through everything that happened, I want to invite you to stay with me. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if you have ever given your last ounce of strength to people who looked the other way, then this story will speak to you. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Not just for me, but because every time one of us shares a story like this, someone else out there feels less alone. Now, let me take you back to that night in the ICU. I remember the ceiling lights, too white, too cold. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth, and how every beep of the monitor sounded like a countdown. I could barely move, but my ears still worked. I heard the nurses. I heard the phones. I heard everything. And when the doctor shook his head and said quietly, "They are not coming," I felt a silence inside me that was louder than the machines. It was not the silence of death. It was the silence of realization. The kind of silence that makes you see your entire life lined up, like receipts on a desk. All the bills I paid for them, all the uniforms I washed, all the birthday cakes I baked alone after their father passed. And now, at my weakest moment, all of that weighed against a ball game, and I lost. I want you to imagine this with me. You are lying in a hospital bed. The doctor calls your children. He says, "If you want to say goodbye, come now." And you hear them laugh. You hear them refuse. You hear them say, "We can't. We're at the ball game." How would you feel? What would break first, your heart or your faith? As I lay there, my body failing, I realized the truth no mother ever wants to face. My sons did not see me anymore. Not as a mother, not even as a person. To them, I was background noise, an obligation they thought could wait. But that night, something inside me shifted. I was done being invisible. That is why, when they finally came a week later, expecting to see me lying weak and waiting, they found only a note. And in that note, for the first time in my life, I told them the truth. I was not born into comfort. My parents were factory workers who taught me early that every dollar had to be stretched like bread dough. When I was 19, I started working as a waitress in a small diner just outside of Cleveland. The hours were long, the tips were never enough. But I learned how to smile even when my feet ached and my back screamed. Back then, I thought life would get easier once I married. I met Robert when I was 22. He was gentle, a mechanic with grease under his fingernails, and laughter that filled every room. We married in a small church, with borrowed flowers and a cake baked by my aunt. He gave me a simple gold band. I wore it with pride because to me, it was not about wealth. It was about building a family together. And we did. Daniel came first, with a loud cry and a head full of dark hair. Mark followed 2 years later, quieter, watchful, but just as precious. Suddenly, my world was not my own anymore. It belonged to them. Every breath, every hour, every sacrifice, it all became about those boys. When money was tight, I cut corners everywhere except on them. I patched my shoes with tape, but Daniel got new cleats for his baseball game. I skipped lunches so Mark could have piano lessons for a year, even though he quit later. I told myself that was what love was: sacrifice. Robert worked hard, but then life did what life often does. He got sick, too soon. Cancer does not care how much you love someone. It does not care that you have 2 little boys who still need their father. One day, he was laughing in the kitchen. The next, he was in a hospital bed. And within a year, he was gone. I was 36, a widow with 2 children and a mortgage. I did not know how I would survive. But I looked at those boys, and I promised them I would. I took extra shifts at the diner. I studied bookkeeping at night, my eyes burning from the fluorescent lights and exhaustion. Eventually, I found a job at a construction company, sitting at a desk with ledgers and calculators. It was steady work. It kept the roof over our heads. But even then, there were choices that hurt. When Daniel wanted to join the travel baseball league, the fee was more than I had. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the bill. My paycheck would not stretch that far. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept Robert's wedding ring, the only piece of jewelry he had given me besides my band. I sold it to a pawn shop downtown. That money bought Daniel's spot on the team. I told myself Robert would have wanted it that way. There were nights when the washing machine broke, and I scrubbed uniforms by hand in the sink, red dirt bleeding into the water until my fingers were raw. I still see myself hanging those jerseys in the backyard, the fabric stiff from soap, praying they would be dry by morning. Mark's glove tore once, right before a big game. We did not have the money for a new one. I stayed up late sewing the leather back together with fishing line, my hands shaking from fatigue. He never even noticed. It just worked when he slipped it on. That was enough for me. Every parent tells themselves these little acts of sacrifice are invisible gifts that one day will be recognized. I believed, foolishly, that my sons would remember. The truth is, they did not. But at the time, I convinced myself it was worth it. When people ask me what I lived by, I used to say, sacrifice is love. I thought it was noble. I thought it made me strong. What it really did was teach my children that my needs, my health, even my dignity could always come last. I see that clearly now. But back then, I wore my sacrifices like a badge. I told myself I was doing God's work by giving up everything for my boys. I didn't see how my silence, the quiet way I endured, was slowly teaching them to take me for granted. I remember one winter vividly. The heating bill skyrocketed, and I could not pay it in full. The house grew cold, my breath visible in the kitchen as I cooked. But Daniel wanted new batting gloves, and I chose them over turning the thermostat higher. My hands cracked and bled from the cold, but when he unwrapped those gloves at Christmas, his face lit up. That smile was my warmth, or so I thought. I never bought myself anything new. My coat had holes in the pockets. My purse strap was frayed. But Daniel and Mark had what they needed to stand shoulder to shoulder with the other boys on the field, to look like they belonged. That mattered more to me than belonging anywhere myself. And then there was the night I stayed up after closing the diner, counting tips. I had $42, just enough to pay for Mark's field trip the next morning. I ate stale crackers in the dark kitchen, and I cried, not from hunger, but from relief that he would not be the only child staying behind. Years stacked on like plates, cracked and glued back together. The weight of them all balanced on my shoulders, but I carried it. I carried it because I thought that was what mothers do. I used to whisper to myself in those late hours while folding laundry or scrubbing dishes, "Sacrifice is love." I wanted to believe that every sleepless night, every dollar spent, every aching bone would one day circle back in the form of respect, gratitude, maybe even tenderness from my sons. But as I lay in that hospital bed decades later, listening to them refuse to leave a ball game to see me, I realized that mantra was a lie. Sacrifice is not love. Love is love. Sacrifice without recognition only breeds entitlement. And that was the truth I could no longer ignore. By the time Daniel and Mark were grown men, I expected some weight to finally lift from my shoulders. I had imagined a day when the bills were not all mine to juggle, when I would not lie awake at night, wondering how to cover 2 rents, 2 car payments, 2 lives. But the truth is, the boys never really left my nest. They only built their lives on top of mine, as if my back was permanent scaffolding. Daniel was the first to slip. After college, he racked up credit card debt chasing weekends in Las Vegas with his friends. He called me late one night, his voice tight with shame. "Mom, I just need this one bailout. I swear it's the last time." I drained what little savings I had, money meant for a new roof, and paid his balance before the collectors came calling. I told myself it was love. Mark was no different. He bought a car far beyond his means, charmed by the glossy ads and the idea of freedom. When the repo men came knocking, I was the one who wrote a check to save his pride. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that when they were older, wiser, steadier, they would see what I had done and step up to carry me for a change. But that day never came. The truth was, I became their safety net, invisible but always stretched thin. And once a net is always there, people forget it has limits. They leap recklessly, certain they will not hit the ground. I kept it all quiet. My coworkers never knew that my paycheck was split 3 ways. My pastor never heard me confess how many nights I ate canned soup so my sons could keep their lights on. Even my sons never knew the full extent because I let them believe the help came easy. I never wanted them to feel the weight I carried. Mrs. Alvarez, my neighbor, saw through me. She was a sharp-eyed widow who had raised 4 children of her own. She used to lean on her fence, arms crossed, and watch me lugging groceries or mowing the lawn alone. One afternoon, after I covered yet another overdue bill for Daniel, I must have let my exhaustion show. She called out, "Helen, you cannot keep doing this." I laughed it off, adjusting the heavy bags in my arms. "They just need time," I said. "They're good boys. They'll find their footing." Mrs. Alvarez shook her head. "Your sons will never grow up if you keep holding the crutch for them," she said in her soft accent. Her words lingered, but I dismissed them with a smile. I wanted to believe that my boys still needed me, that my sacrifices were still worth something. Without them needing me, what was I? So I continued. When Daniel's marriage crumbled because he spent more than he earned, I helped him cover the apartment rent so his children would not have to move. When Mark lost his job after showing up late too many times, I let him stay in my spare room, his dirty laundry piled high while I tiptoed around, still cooking his favorite meals. I remember once, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the checkbook. My bank balance was barely 3 figures. Yet Daniel's voice echoed in my ear from the night before. "Mom, just this once more." The pen felt heavy in my hand as I wrote the check. I told myself that was what mothers do. Mrs. Alvarez knocked that same week, carrying a plate of tamales. She set them down on my counter and looked me straight in the eye. "Helen," she said, "love is not rescuing. Love is teaching them to swim, not carrying them on your back forever." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that without me, they would drown. Instead, I smiled thinly and said, "They'll get there. I still feel needed." The truth was, I clung to that feeling, needed. If they ever stopped needing me, I was terrified I would vanish into the background, just another old widow with no purpose. My sacrifices, I thought, were my ticket to relevance. But slowly, the sacrifices shifted from noble to humiliating. I hid the overdue notices from my own mailbox, tearing them into tiny pieces before anyone could see. I pawned my jewelry, the last bits Robert had given me. I skipped my own medical appointments because co-pays felt extravagant compared to Daniel's phone bill or Mark's car insurance. I told no one, not my church group, not my boss, not even Mrs. Alvarez when she pressed. To the world, I was still the strong mother who held her family together. To myself, I was a bank that never closed, an anchor no one respected, but everyone depended on. Looking back, I see the pattern clearly. Every last time was followed by another. Every promise to change was drowned by silence. And every warning from Mrs. Alvarez was brushed aside by my desperate need to feel important. I see her now, standing on that fence line, shaking her head. "Your sons will never grow up if you keep holding the crutch for them." At the time, I believed she was wrong. I thought I was building loyalty, that one day Daniel and Mark would look back and realize how much of myself I gave away. I was wrong. I had always marked Robert's birthday and our wedding anniversary with a quiet ritual. Even after he passed, I kept the tradition alive. I would cook his favorite meal, lasagna layered thick with ricotta and mozzarella. And I would set the table as if he might walk in from the fields like he used to. For years, it was just me and the memory of him. But this time, I wanted my sons to come home. I called Daniel first. "It's the day your father and I were married," I said, trying to make my voice sound light, not pleading. "I thought maybe you and Mark could come over for dinner. I'm making lasagna." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then his voice came back, distracted. Mom, tonight's the big game. We've got tickets already. Maybe another night?" I tried not to let the disappointment leak into my voice. "Of course," I said softly. "Enjoy the game." I called Mark anyway, hoping he might be different. He laughed gently. Mom, you know how much Daniel's into baseball. I can't ditch him. We'll come by this weekend instead, okay? I told him it was fine. I always told them it was fine. That evening, I pulled out the lasagna dish anyway. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes, the oven humming like an old friend. I laid the table with 3 plates. I even polished the silverware, the good set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift. I set out 2 wine glasses for the boys, though I knew they would stay empty. When I stepped back, the table looked both full and heartbreakingly bare. 2 empty chairs sat across from me, waiting for sons who would never arrive. I folded the napkins neatly, smoothing them with my hand. The silence in the house was so loud it pressed on my chest. I lit a candle in the middle of the table. Its flame flickered as if to mock me. I sat down with my plate of lasagna, cut into the steaming layers, and tried to eat. But each bite felt heavy. My eyes wandered to the 2 empty plates, the glasses untouched. I imagined my boys cheering in the stadium, the roar of the crowd drowning out any thought of me. For them, it was just another night. For me, it was a wound reopening. Halfway through my meal, my chest tightened. At first, I thought it was just the weight of sadness. But then, the pain grew sharper, searing through my ribs like fire. I gasped, clutching at the table for balance. The fork clattered from my hand onto the plate. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. The room spun. I collapsed to the cold tile floor of the kitchen, the lasagna scent mingling with the sterile tang of fear in my throat. My breathing came in shallow bursts. I felt sweat on my forehead, my body heavy, too heavy to move. Through the fog, I thought of Robert. I whispered his name. And then, in the dark edges of my mind, I wondered if this was how it ended. On the floor of a kitchen I had spent my life keeping warm, alone, with no one to notice. It might have been minutes or hours. I could not tell when I heard the sharp rap of knuckles on glass. Then a voice. Mrs. Alvarez. She often stopped by in the evenings, sometimes with leftover tamales, sometimes just to chat. She must have seen the candle flickering in the window or sensed something was wrong. Helen, she called. Then louder. Helen, are you there? I wanted to answer, but my voice caught in my throat. I heard her footsteps on the porch, then the creak of the door. She must have pushed it open. Helen, she cried when she saw me sprawled on the kitchen floor. Her hands were on my face a moment later, warm and trembling. Oh God, hold on, querida. I'm calling 911. The sound of her phone dialing was a lifeline. Her voice was urgent but steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. 64-year-old woman, severe chest pain. She's collapsed. She's not responsive. Yes, 184 Maple Street, hurry. She stayed by my side, brushing the hair from my face, whispering words I could barely hear. Stay with me, Helen. You are not leaving us tonight. The sirens came fast, their wails piercing the quiet of the neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed across the walls of my kitchen, a surreal dance of color over the plates still waiting at the table. 2 paramedics rushed in, lifting me gently onto a stretcher. I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Alvarez standing in the doorway, her hands pressed together in prayer. As they wheeled me out, my eyes caught the table one last time, the lasagna cooling, the wine glasses empty, the chairs still waiting. The ambulance doors shut with a slam. Inside, the medic's voice echoed above me. Stay with us, ma'am. Can you hear me? I tried to answer, but the world blurred, the pain pulling me under. The last thing I remember was the thought that Daniel and Mark were cheering in the stands, oblivious to the fact that their mother was fighting for her life. And I, Helen, was utterly alone. I woke to the sound of voices, muffled at first, as though I were underwater. The sharp beeps of machines punctured the haze, and I realized I was in a hospital bed. My chest felt heavy, wrapped in fire. Tubes ran into my arm. I blinked against the sterile light above me, my breath shallow and ragged. Then I heard the doctor's voice, calm but urgent. He was standing near the foot of my bed, speaking into the phone. "Yes, this is Dr. Matthews. I'm calling about your mother, Helen Carter. She's in critical condition. I need you to understand. She may not survive tonight." The words cut through the fog like glass. My heart stuttered as I waited for the reply. A man's voice crackled back, unmistakable. "Daniel, my son. We can't leave. We're at the ball game." For a moment, I thought I must have misheard. Surely he didn't say that. But the silence that followed was confirmation enough. The doctor spoke again, more insistent now. "Sir, I'm telling you this may be her last night. If you want to see her, you need to come now." Daniel's voice came again, flat, impatient. "I told you, we're at the game. We'll check in later." Then the line went dead. I lay there, the weight of the words pressing harder than the pain in my chest. My son, my boy, whom I had raised with every scrap of strength and sacrifice, had chosen a stadium seat over my bedside. My lips parted, but no sound came out. The doctor glanced at me, perhaps realizing I had heard. His face softened with pity, and that pity was almost worse than the pain. Minutes later, another call. The doctor tried Mark. His voice was lighter, almost rehearsed. "Doc, I can't just walk out. Daniel's here with me. We'll come by tomorrow, okay?" Tomorrow. As if tomorrow were promised. The line went dead again. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little specks of gray, trying to anchor myself. The truth was undeniable now. My sons were not coming. Not tonight. Maybe not at all. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced them back. Crying would take energy, and I had so little left. My chest rose and fell in uneven waves, each breath feeling like a battle I wasn't sure I could win. The door creaked, and a nurse slipped in. She was young, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled into a bun. She checked my monitors, adjusted the IV. Then she noticed my trembling hand, half curled on the blanket. Without hesitation, she reached out and wrapped her warm fingers around mine. "I'm here," she whispered. Just 2 words, simple, software. But they filled the cavern of my loneliness in a way my son's voices never could. Her hand stayed with mine, steady, unflinching. The machines hummed, my breath wheezed, and in the quiet of that moment, I realized something I had avoided for years. I was not their priority. The thought sliced through me, clean and merciless. For decades, I had believed sacrifice was love, that if I gave enough, bent enough, carried enough, my boys would know my worth. But lying in that bed, abandoned while they cheered for a team that couldn't even pronounce their names, I finally saw the truth. Sacrifice had not bound them to me. It had excused them. It had given them permission to take and take without ever learning to give. I closed my eyes and drifted in and out of a restless doze. Sometimes I dreamed of Robert, his hand on mine, his voice telling me I had done enough. Other times, I woke to the nurse's quiet movements, her presence like a candle flickering against the dark. At one point, she adjusted my oxygen mask and said softly, "You're stronger than you think." Stronger. I wanted to laugh. My body felt like a failing engine, sputtering with each breath. But in the hollow space where my son's love should have been, a tiny ember glowed. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps strength wasn't in the body, but in the choice to see things clearly at last. The night dragged on, each hour an eternity. The monitors beeped, the IV dripped, and the hallway outside echoed with distant footsteps. But my room remained still, empty save for the nurse's occasional visits. I kept replaying their words in my mind. "We can't leave. We're at the ball game." A sentence that should never belong to a son whose mother was dying. And yet it was mine to carry now, carved into me like stone. As dawn crept through the narrow window, pale light brushing across the linoleum floor, I lay awake. I felt hollow, but in that hollow space, something began to shift. A reckoning. I had lived my life believing love was proved by what I gave. But what good was sacrifice if it left me alone in my hour of need? What kind of love required me to vanish piece by piece until nothing of me remained? The nurse came in one last time before her shift ended. She squeezed my hand again, her eyes tired but still kind. "You made it through the night," she said softly. "Yes," I whispered, my voice hoarse but steady. I did. But inside, I was thinking something else. Not just that I had survived, but that I had woken. That the long night had shown me a truth I could no longer deny. I was not their priority. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop making them mine. The following morning, the nurse returned with a clipboard of forms. I asked her quietly, almost shyly, "Could you bring me a sheet of paper? And a pen?" She tilted her head, curious, but didn't press. Within minutes, she came back with hospital stationery and a blue ballpoint pen. She set them gently on the rolling tray beside my bed. My hands trembled as I reached for them, the IV tugging at my skin. The paper looked so clean, so expectant. I stared at it for a long while, letting the silence of the room settle around me. Outside, I could hear a cart squeak past, the faint chatter of nurses changing shifts. But inside, there was only me, the pen, and the weight of decades pressing against my chest. I thought of all the words I had never said, all the nights I had prayed for the strength to carry on, all the times I swallowed my disappointment, convinced that silence was the same as love. My hand began to move. "Daniel, Mark, if you are reading this, it means you arrived too late." I paused, the ink pooling at the edge of the pen. My eyes blurred, but I forced myself to keep writing. "I don't write this to wound you. I write this so you will finally see me, not as the mother who always stood in the shadows of your choices, but as the woman who gave everything and was left with nothing." My breath caught, but I pressed on. I let the memories pour out, unfiltered. The nights I worked double shifts at the diner, my feet blistered and my back aching, just so I could pay for your cleats. The day I sold my wedding ring to cover the league fees. The countless times I scrubbed your uniforms in the sink, my knuckles raw, while you slept soundly in warm beds. I wrote of the phone calls from creditors, the red-stamped envelopes, the quiet deals I made to cover your mistakes, how I shielded you from the word debt, thinking I was sparing you shame, when in truth, I was only burying myself deeper. And then I wrote the line that had haunted me all night. I was there in the first bleachers. You weren't in the last. The words lay stark against the page, heavier than any sentence I had ever spoken. I set the pen down, letting my fingers rest. My chest ached, but there was a strange relief in the release of it all. For the first time, my truth had shape, had weight beyond the confines of my body. Then I reached for my purse, which the nurse had placed on the chair by the wall. With high effort, I unzipped the worn leather and searched inside. Beneath a folded grocery receipt and a tube of faded lipstick, I found what I was looking for: a ticket stub. The first game I ever took Daniel to. He was 7. His eyes had lit up like the stadium lights themselves, his little hands clutching the bag of peanuts I had saved for weeks to buy. The team had lost miserably, but it hadn't mattered. What mattered was that we were there together. The stub was crumpled now, its ink faded, but I'd kept it all these years. Proof of my presence. Proof that I had shown up. I slipped it carefully between the pages of the letter, securing it like a seal. A relic of love, but also of absence. When the nurse returned to check on me, she noticed the paper folded neatly on the tray. "Would you like me to place this somewhere safe?" she asked gently. I nodded. "On the bed. If they come and I'm not here, they'll find it." She hesitated, as though she understood the weight of what I had written, then placed it carefully at the foot of the bed. I leaned back against the pillow, exhausted but strangely lighter. My body still hurt, my breaths still came shallow, but my spirit felt unburdened. I had finally spoken the truth I had hidden for too long. For the rest of the day, I drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes I dreamed of the bleachers, the roar of the crowd, the smell of popcorn in the air. Other times I dreamed of silence, of sitting alone in my kitchen with 2 empty chairs. When I woke, the letter was still there, waiting, like me. I knew my sons might never read it the way I intended. They might skim, dismiss, even tear it apart in anger. But the act of writing it was for me as much as it was for them. It was my line in the sand, my final say. And if they ever did read it, perhaps, just perhaps, they would see beyond the ink. They would see the years I had poured into them, the quiet sacrifices that had no scoreboard, no cheering crowd. As the evening shadows stretched across the floor, I whispered aloud, more to myself than anyone else. Sacrifice is love, but love is not sacrifice. It was a truth I should have known years ago, but better late than never. I closed my eyes and let the room fade around me. The letter lay still at the end of the bed, its secret tucked inside. And I felt, for the first time in years, that I had said what needed saying. The next morning, the door creaked open, and I saw a familiar figure step in. Mrs. Alvarez, my neighbor, walked softly toward my bed with a bouquet of carnations in her hands. They were pink, the kind she grew by her front porch every summer. "You didn't think I'd let you go through this alone, did you?" she said, with a smile that was kind but heavy at the edges. I tried to sit up straighter, though the IV tugged against my arm. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself," I whispered. "Nonsense," she replied, pulling a chair to my bedside. She placed the flowers in a plastic water cup and set it on the tray. The faint scent lifted the sterile air. For a moment, we sat in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of things neither of us needed to explain. Then she leaned closer. "You know, Helen, I once lay in a bed just like this. Not in this hospital, but one across town. It was after my gallbladder surgery. Do you know who I waited for? I shook my head. My daughter, she said, her voice steady but soft. But she never came. She had other priorities, a new boyfriend, a job she thought couldn't wait. And there I was, staring at the clock, hoping the next tick meant she'd walk in. Her words landed like stones in water, rippling outward into my own memories. I remembered the hours I had waited for Daniel and Mark, the phone pressed to my ear as the doctor tried again, their voices sharp with disinterest. Mrs. Alvarez continued. I thought it was just me, that I had failed somehow as a mother, that I hadn't given enough, or maybe I'd given too much. I tortured myself with the what-ifs, but then I realized. She paused, looking at me, her eyes moist but firm. It wasn't me. It was them, their choices, their blindness. My worth wasn't measured by their presence or absence. Her hand reached across the blanket and covered mine. Warmth spread through my cold fingers. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I always believed sacrifice was love, I whispered. That if I gave enough, it would be returned. She shook her head gently. Sacrifice is only love if it's recognized. Otherwise, it's erosion. It eats away at you, Helen, and you don't deserve to be eaten away. I stared at her face, the lines carved deep from years of labor and endurance. Yet behind them, there was strength, the kind that comes not from never being broken, but from surviving the breaking. In a reflection, I saw myself. The same ache, the same yearning, the same realization that we had given too much and received too little. And yet, sitting here together, I felt something stir, a thread of connection, a reminder that the emptiness wasn't mine alone to carry. For the first time, I said it aloud. I am not their priority. The words trembled out of me, but once spoken, they steadied. It felt like a wound being cleaned, stinging but necessary. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed my hand. And that doesn't mean you are not worthy. It just means it's time to choose yourself. Her words settled into me like medicine. Not the bitter kind, but the healing kind you didn't know you needed until it began to work. I let out a long breath. We are not alone, are we? She smiled, her eyes shining. No, Helen, never alone. There are more of us than you think. We sat like that for a while, hand in hand, two women bound not by blood, but by understanding. And in that stillness, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt solidarity. The letter I had written the night before was still folded at the foot of my bed. I thought of it then, not with grief, but with clarity. My truth wasn't just mine anymore. It echoed in others, like Mrs. Alvarez, like countless women who had carried the same hidden scars. As she rose to leave, she leaned down and kissed my forehead. Rest, she said. And remember, Helen, your story isn't over. When the door closed behind her, the room no longer felt so empty. For the first time in years, I felt seen, and that seeing gave me strength. A week passed before my sons finally showed up. By then, I was no longer in that hospital bed. I had been discharged to rest at home, the machines and sterile walls exchanged for the quiet of my own house. But the nurse later told me what happened the day they walked in. They looked like ghosts when they read your words, she said. I closed my eyes, letting her description paint the scene in my mind. I could imagine them. Daniel in his pressed khakis, Mark in his baseball cap still turned backward as if he were 16 again. They had probably walked into the hospital with the same careless stride they always carried, confident the world would wait for them, confident that I would wait for them. But what they found instead was absence. The bed was stripped clean, the sheets tucked tight, the pillows fluffed, and on that empty space, a single folded letter lay waiting. My handwriting on the front, their names written in a careful line. Between the pages, I had tucked that faded baseball ticket, the first one I had ever bought, the one I saved after selling my wedding ring just so Daniel could feel like he belonged among the other boys. The nurse told me they froze when they saw it. Neither reached for the letter at first, as if the paper itself might burn. Finally, Mark picked it up, his hand trembling. He unfolded it, and as his eyes moved across my words, the color drained from his face. I had written, "I was there in the first bleachers, cheering until my voice cracked. I patched your uniforms, cooked your meals, paid your debts in silence. I believed sacrifice was love. But love without respect is only servitude. Tonight, the doctor said I might not survive. And when they called you, you chose seats in the stadium over a chair at my bedside. That is when I finally saw the truth. You were not there in my last bleachers. You never came. And I cannot carry this illusion anymore." The nurse said Mark's lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. Daniel tried to take the letter from him, but when his eyes scanned the same lines, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, they saw me not as a background figure, not as the silent provider, but as a woman who had lived, loved, and broken under the weight of their neglect. "They didn't say a word, Mrs. Helen," the nurse told me. "They just stood there, pale as stone. When they left, it was like they were carrying the weight of a coffin." I listened in, silence as she recounted it, her voice low, her hands folding the blanket at the end of my bed. She didn't need to embellish. I could feel it. For once, the mirror had turned, and they were forced to look at themselves. "For once," I whispered, "they finally saw me." The words came out not with anger, not with triumph, but with a deep sigh that seemed to empty years of sorrow from my chest. I did not wish them destruction, nor did I imagine revenge as flames and fury. My justice was quieter, more enduring. It was the justice of truth finally spoken, of sacrifice finally named for what it had become, a chain I was choosing to set down. As I lay in my own bed that night, the letter's words replayed in my mind, not with regret. I had spent too many years drowning in regret. This time, I felt release. I had told them my truth, and whether they could carry it or not was no longer mine to decide. I thought back to Mrs. Alvarez sitting by my side, her hand warm on mine, her words echoing. It wasn't me. It was them. She was right. And now my sons had to live with the knowledge of their own choices. Perhaps one day they would understand the depth of what they had thrown aside. Perhaps one day they would come, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. But even if that day never came, I had finally found a kind of peace. Because I had seen it in their faces, even secondhand through the nurse's story. I had seen the moment the illusion shattered. The moment they realized that love is not a bottomless well, that a mother is not immortal, that my heart had limits they had pushed too far. And in that recognition, in their shock and pallor, I had received my justice. Quiet, dignified, but powerful. As the night deepened and the house fell silent around me, I whispered again into the darkness. For once, they finally saw me. And I let myself rest, not as their servant, not as their safety net, but as Helen, a woman who had given, and at last, had chosen to reclaim her own worth. The following week, when my strength had returned enough for me to walk without clutching the walls, I made an appointment with Mr. Green, the community lawyer who had known my late husband. His office was a modest brick building near the courthouse, lined with shelves of case files and photographs of local charity drives. He looked up when I entered, his kind eyes widening with both surprise and relief. "Helen," he said, pulling out a chair for me, "you gave us all quite a scare. Sit down. What brings you here?" I eased into the chair, folding my hands in my lap. For a moment, I let the silence settle. Then I spoke the words I had carried for decades, but never dared to voice. "Mr. Green, I need to draw new boundaries. I need a living trust. And I need it to reflect my choices, not my son's expectations." He leaned back, studying me. "This is not just paperwork for you, is it?" "No," I replied, my voice steady. "This is me, reclaiming myself." For years, I had funneled everything I owned into protecting Daniel and Mark. I had paid off their credit card debt, covered the back rent when they were about to be evicted, and even co-signed loans that nearly drowned me. Each time, I told myself it was what mothers did. Each time, I believed I was saving them from ruin, but all I had done was save them from growing up. Now, I was done. We went through the documents together, his pen scratching against the paper as he drafted clauses. I named myself as the primary trustee, with clear instructions for what would happen when I passed. My sons were not excluded entirely, but they were no longer the center of my legacy. Instead, I designated a large portion of my savings to create a community scholarship in my husband's name, a way to honor the love we had shared, the sacrifices we had both made, and to give young people the opportunities my boys had squandered. As I signed the papers, I felt a strange lightness, as though the ink itself was lifting years of weight from my shoulders. Mr. Green looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "You know," he said softly, "this is one of the bravest acts of love I've seen. Not for them, but for yourself, and for the ones who will never forget what you've done." I nodded, my eyes misting. For once, it's not about rescuing them. It's about building something that lasts. We also updated my emergency contacts. I told Mr. Green to add Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who had called 911 when I collapsed. She had shown up when my own children had not. She deserved that trust, and more than that, I deserved to know that if the worst happened, someone who truly cared would be called. When I left his office, the sun was setting, painting the courthouse steps in orange light. My folder of documents felt heavier than its paper should allow, but also solid, grounding. It was proof that my life was no longer tethered to two men who had never shown up when it mattered most. That night, as I prepared a simple dinner, I thought back to the countless times I had dug into my emergency fund for Daniel and Mark. I remembered signing checks with shaking hands, worried about how I would pay the utilities after bailing them out. I remembered standing in a bank lobby, co-signing a loan for Daniel's failed business, while he assured me, "I'll pay it back, Mom. I swear." He never did. Mark had once called me crying because his car was about to be repossessed. I had drained half my savings to cover the payments, telling myself that a mother's love demanded sacrifice. But what it had really demanded was silence. Silence about my own needs. Silence about my own worth. As I sat alone at the table, I realized that silence had ended the moment I signed those papers. The twist of irony was not lost on me. After all those years of rescuing them from bankruptcy, from failure, from the consequences of their own choices, it was now I who was finally rescuing myself by stopping, by letting go, by choosing not to play savior anymore. I set my fork down and whispered into the stillness of my kitchen, "It's over." Not with bitterness, but with a quiet finality that tasted like freedom. For the first time in decades, I could imagine a future not built on sacrifice, but on purpose. The scholarship would carry my husband's name long after I was gone. Mrs. Alvarez would be my safeguard. And I, Helen, would no longer be defined by debts, disappointments, or the endless echo of stadium cheers that never once turned back to see me. That night, I slept without the weight of worry pressing against my chest. I slept not as the mother who gave everything away, but as the woman who had finally drawn a line. And in that line, I found myself. It was a gray afternoon when the knock came. I knew before opening the door who it would be. Daniel stood on the porch, shoulders tight, eyes restless, like a boy caught stealing but too proud to admit it. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his words spilling out before I could even greet him. "Mom, how could you? Do you have any idea how this makes us feel? You set up some scholarship. You change everything without telling us. Do you realize you're making us feel guilty?" His voice carried both accusation and desperation, the familiar tone of someone who had always leaned on my shoulders, never once imagining I might shrug the weight off. I let him speak. Years of motherhood had taught me the value of patience, but this time it was not patience born of submission. It was a stillness carved from clarity. When he finally paused, waiting for me to rush in with an apology as I had so many times before, I shook my head gently. "No, Daniel," I said, my voice calm, even. "I didn't do it to make you feel guilty. I did it so that I no longer feel sorry for myself." His eyes widened, confusion flashing across his face. It was as if he had expected every reaction except this one. For the first time in our lives, I watched him search for words instead of flooding me with them. "I don't understand," he muttered. "You don't have to," I answered softly. "What you need to know is this. I gave everything I had for years. I gave so much that I lost track of who I was outside of being your safety net. And when I needed you most, you chose the ball game." That night, lying in a hospital bed, I realized I couldn't keep living as a ghost in my own life. So I changed the ending. He flinched, as though my words were heavier than any shouted rebuke could have been. He looked around my kitchen, his gaze landing on the dining table. There were only 2 chairs now, neatly pushed in. "Where are the others?" he asked quietly, perhaps noticing what was missing more than what was present. "I gave them away," I replied. "I don't wait for anyone to fill empty chairs anymore. If someone wants to be here, they'll bring their own." The silence that followed was thick. He shifted, uneasy, his hands clenching at his sides. I could see the boy in him, the one who had once relied on me to wash his muddy uniform, to cheer from the bleachers, to rescue him with checks and signatures. But I also saw the man he had become, or perhaps refused to become, when I shielded him too long. "Mom," he started, his voice breaking for the first time. I raised my hand gently, not to silence him in anger, but to draw the boundary that had been absent for far too long. "This isn't a conversation to fix what's broken overnight," I said. "It's a door, and I'm choosing to close it for now. If one day you want to stand at it as a man, not a boy demanding rescue, then maybe it can open again, but not today. I rose slowly, steady on my feet. For once, he seemed smaller than me, not in height, but in presence. I walked to the door, placed my hand on the knob, and opened it. He hesitated, as if he might argue again, but when he met my eyes, he found no anger there, only the quiet power of someone who has finally chosen herself. Without another word, I stepped aside. He walked out, his shoulders sagging as though carrying a weight he had never acknowledged before. I closed the door gently, the click of the lock echoing through the stillness of my house. I leaned against the wood, breathing deep. The dining table stood behind me with its 2 chairs. Not waiting, not expecting, just enough for the life I had reclaimed. And for the first time, the emptiness was not loneliness. It was freedom. After the storm of confrontation, after the years of carrying burdens that were never mine alone, I finally made a move that was entirely for me. I packed my belongings, just the essentials, a few photo frames, my worn Bible, the quilt my mother stitched decades ago. I left the large house that had echoed with emptiness for too long and stepped into a small apartment near the public library. It was modest, 1 bedroom and a narrow balcony that overlooked a row of maples. But it was mine. Every corner belonged to me, not as a caretaker for others, but as a woman who had earned peace. I ran my hands across the countertop, smooth and clean, and smiled. For the first time, I wasn't setting a table for others. I wasn't arranging chairs to wait for those who might not come. This space did not beg for anyone's presence. It only asked for mine. The first night in that apartment, I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes. The silence was different here. Not heavy or punishing, but restful, like a pause between heartbeats. I looked around at my modest treasures and felt a warmth spread inside me. Mrs. Alvarez had helped me carry a few boxes up the stairs, shaking her head at how little I kept. But I told her that lightness was a gift. She laughed and said, "Helen, maybe now you'll finally live for yourself." She was right. The next morning, I walked 2 blocks to the library. Its tall brick walls and wide wooden doors felt like an embrace. I signed up for a new library card, the plastic still stiff in my hand. I ran my thumb across my name printed on it, smiling at the idea that even here, in this small way, I was starting anew. I wandered the aisles, breathing in the scent of paper and ink, rows upon rows of stories lined up like promises. For years, I had lived everyone else's story. Now, I would choose my own. Later that week, I did something simple but profound. I walked into the bakery across the street, the one with glass cases lined with frosted cakes and flaky pies. The clerk, a young woman with freckles, greeted me with a bright smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'd like that chocolate cake, the one with the thick icing." She reached for the box. "Special occasion?" I paused, then smiled. "Yes, for me." Her eyebrows lifted, then she nodded with a kind of respect I hadn't expected. She slid the cake into a white box, tied it with red string, and handed it to me. It was heavier than I thought, not just in weight, but in meaning. For decades, I had baked and bought cakes for birthdays, graduations, baseball victories that never included me in the photograph. I had sliced them into pieces, serving everyone else first, keeping only the crumbs. That evening, I set the cake on my small kitchen table, lit a single candle, and cut myself a generous slice. I took the fork in my hand, held it for a moment, and whispered, "For decades, I served everyone else a slice. Tonight, I eat mine whole." The first bite was sweet, almost overwhelming. Tears stung my eyes, not from sadness, but from release. Every flavor was a reminder that I deserved joy, that I had been starving not for food, but for acknowledgement, for respect, for the permission to take up space in my own life. I sat back in the chair and looked at the table. Only one plate, only one fork, and it was enough. In the weeks that followed, I created a new rhythm. Mornings at the library, afternoons tending a few potted plants on my balcony, evenings reading or writing letters that had no obligation, only choice. Sometimes Mrs. Alvarez would join me for tea, and we would sit in the golden light, two women who had known abandonment but chose resilience. My sons tried to call. I let the phone ring. Not from hatred, but from boundary. I no longer rushed to save them from themselves. They would have to face their own nights of silence. Perhaps, in time, they would learn what I had learned, that love without respect is only chains disguised as care. One evening, as I closed a book and watched the sunset paint the sky in streaks of pink and gold, I felt an unfamiliar sensation. Peace. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of dignity. I had not been erased by my sacrifices. I had simply been waiting all along to reclaim the woman who lived underneath them. The chocolate cake became my small ritual. Each month, I bought a slice or baked one myself, not because I needed sweets, but because it was a reminder that I no longer lived on crumbs. I lived on fullness. And in that small apartment near the library, with the quiet hum of life unfolding outside my window, I finally understood what freedom tasted like. It was rich, it was bittersweet, and it was entirely mine. In the months that followed, my days settled into a rhythm that felt like breathing for the first time in years. Each afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls of my little apartment in shades of amber, I set out 2 teacups. Mrs. Alvarez would come knocking right on time, her steps slow but sure, carrying a small tin of cookies she insisted on sharing. We would sit at my tiny table, steam rising from our cups, the clink of porcelain filling the space once dominated by silence. Our conversations were gentle, sometimes filled with laughter, sometimes with pauses, where our eyes did the speaking. She told me stories about her youth in Mexico, about the years she spent working double shifts at the diner to give her children chances they never seemed to notice. I shared my own memories, some painful, some tender, and each time I spoke, I felt less like a woman defined by abandonment and more like one defined by survival. We had both lost the illusion of children who would stand by us. But in its place, we had gained something different. A chosen family. One built not on blood, but on understanding. It was during one of these tea afternoons that a letter arrived from the community center. My scholarship fund, the one I had set up with my savings, had chosen its first recipient. A girl named Emily. She was 14, a promising young athlete, the only girl on her school's baseball team. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and her father had long since left. The scholarship would cover her gear, travel, and training fees. When I read her name out loud, Mrs. Alvarez clasped her hands together and said, "Dios mío, Helen, you are planting seeds." A week later, I was invited to the community hall for a small ceremony. The room was simple, folding chairs, banners hand-painted by volunteers, the smell of coffee brewing in the back. Parents, children, neighbors filled the space with quiet pride. When Emily walked in, I saw myself reflected in her, a girl with bright eyes and a uniform too big for her thin frame, clutching her worn glove like it was the most precious thing she owned. They called my name to the front. I walked slowly, my steps steady, my heart beating in a rhythm that was not fear, but fullness. Emily stood there, shifting nervously from foot to foot. I smiled at her, and she smiled back, shy but fierce. I handed her the scholarship certificate, the official proof of support. But then, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small wooden frame. Inside it was the faded ticket from the very first baseball game I had ever attended for my sons. I had saved it, for decades, tucked it between bills, journals, and prayers, a reminder of where my sacrifices began. I pressed the frame into her hands. This, I told her softly, was my first seat in the bleachers. I was there cheering with everything I had. I hope you carry it with you, and remember that someone believes in you. Don't waste your light waiting for others to see it. Shine anyway. Her eyes widened. She looked down at the ticket, then back at me. For a moment, her lower lip trembled, but she held it together the way athletes do, strong in front of a crowd. She nodded, gripping the frame to her chest. The audience clapped. I could see her mother wiping her eyes in the back row. And in that moment, something inside me healed. The ticket, once a symbol of all I gave away without return, had transformed into a torch passed to someone who might carry it differently. Not as a burden, but as fuel. After the ceremony, Emily came up to me. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. "I won't forget this." I touched her shoulder and said, "Play hard, Emily. Play for yourself." That night, as Mrs. Alvarez and I shared our tea, I told her what happened. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "See, Helen? The world does not end when blood disappoints you. Sometimes it begins when strangers become kin." I looked at the 2 cups on my table, at the warmth of her presence in my life, and I knew she was right. I had lost my sons to their own selfishness, but I had gained something richer. A young girl chasing her dream, an old friend by my side, and a community that now carried a piece of my heart forward. The chosen family we build is not always the one we expect, but sometimes it is the one that saves us. And as I set my cup down that evening, I felt no emptiness, only gratitude. In the quiet months after my recovery, I heard less and less from my sons. Their absence became another kind of silence I had to learn to live with. But word has a way of traveling in a small community. Through neighbors and whispers at the grocery store, I began to hear pieces of their lives unraveling. Daniel had lost his job. The company downsized, and his name was on the list. Mark, meanwhile, had racked up debts with credit cards and a failed investment scheme. The 2 of them, once united in neglect, were now at odds with each other, fighting over the idea of inheritance they thought would save them. I was not surprised. For years, I had been their safety net, the invisible cushion that softened every fall. I paid overdue bills without a word, co-signed loans that nearly ruined my credit, and even sold my wedding ring to keep their lights on. They had grown used to the certainty that I would always bail them out. But now, for the first time, that certainty was gone. I remember the day Daniel showed up at my door. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. He looked older than his years, the weight of unemployment pressing on him like a storm cloud. "Mom," he began. his voice hoarse. "I just need a little help until I get back on my feet. You know I'm good for it." I studied him quietly. Once upon a time, those words would have moved me. I would have rushed to my checkbook, convincing myself that love meant rescue. But this time, I only shook my head. "I'm sorry, Daniel," I said softly. "But no." His face tightened. "No? After everything you gave to strangers, to some scholarship fund, you can't spare a little for your own son?" I felt the sting of his words, but I stood firm. "My love is free, Daniel. My money is not. Not anymore." He clenched his fists, then let them drop to his sides. For a moment, I saw something raw flicker in his eyes. Not just anger, but fear. Fear of failing. Fear of facing the world without me as his crutch. He turned away without another word, and I closed the door, knowing this was the first true boundary I had ever drawn with him. Not long after, Mark called me. His voice was rushed, almost desperate. "Mom, listen," he said. "Daniel's losing it. He blames me for everything, but you know the truth. You know I tried. I just made some bad calls with the money. But if you step in, just this once, we can fix it before it gets worse." I could hear the chaos in the background, a television blaring, the clatter of dishes, maybe even a slammed door. His life was unraveling, and he wanted me to stitch it back together. "Mark," I said gently, "I know you're scared. But I can't fix this for you. That's not my role anymore." He grew quiet, the silence stretching long enough for me to hear his uneven breathing. Finally, he asked, almost in a whisper, "So that's it? You're just leaving us to drown?" Tears pricked my eyes, but I held steady. "Number, I'm letting you swim. You can't learn if I keep carrying you." He didn't reply. The line went dead, and for a moment, I felt the ache of finality. The instinct to protect them still tugged at me, but I knew that surrendering to it would undo all the strength I had rebuilt. In the weeks that followed, I heard they argued bitterly, blaming each other for their misfortunes. Daniel accused Mark of dragging the family name through the mud with his debts. Mark accused Daniel of being lazy, of never holding a job long enough. Their voices, once raised in tandem at baseball games, now clashed in anger over money they would never receive. I allowed myself a moment of sorrow. After all, they were my sons, flesh of my flesh. To watch them unravel was a kind of grief, but grief and regret are not the same. For the first time, I did not regret drawing my line in the sand. I remembered Mrs. Alvarez's words, spoken over countless cups of tea. "We cannot rescue people who choose to stay broken." And I thought of Emily, the young girl clutching that framed ticket, her eyes blazing with determination. She had reminded me of what hope looked like when it was still pure, when it was not twisted by entitlement or dulled by ingratitude. That was where my energy belonged now. So when Daniel and Mark circled back again, trying to guilt me with tears or anger, I met them with the same answer, steady as a stone. My love is free. My money is not. They could argue, they could curse, they could walk away in rage or return in shame. But my resolve would not change. Because for once, I was no longer a mother defined by what she gave away. I was a woman defined by what she chose to keep: her dignity, her peace, and her power. The days have grown slower now, quieter in ways that no longer feel like emptiness, but instead like rest. I sit most mornings by the window of my small apartment, the light filtering in just enough to warm my hands as I cradle a cup of tea. The steam curls upward, delicate and steady, like the rhythm of my breath. There was a time when silence felt like punishment, but now it feels like a companion. The clock on the wall ticks softly, each second marking not loss, but continuity. I lean back, the chair creaking gently beneath me, and I let myself remember, not with bitterness, but with clarity. In the stillness, I hear again the words I once pressed into paper, the letter I left behind on that hospital bed. Words that carried the weight of decades, words I had never dared to say aloud until then. I am not your afterthought. I was always enough. Hearing them again, in my own mind, is like hearing my truest self speak back to me. For years, I measured my worth by what I could give, what I could sacrifice, what I could endure. I told myself that love was proven only through labor, through denial of self, through standing in the shadows so my children could stand in the sun. But that night in the hospital, when the doctors called my sons and their answer was a ball game instead of my bedside, something broke, and in breaking, something else was born. I sip my tea, its warmth spreading through me, and I realize I no longer feel the ache of waiting. I no longer wait for a call that may never come, for footsteps that may never climb the stairs to my door, for apologies that may never be spoken. Waiting was its own kind of chain, and now I am free of it. The lasagna pan I once scrubbed for family dinners sits empty in the cupboard, untouched, but not forgotten. The chairs around my table remain few, by choice, no longer symbols of absence, but of intention. When I set the table now, I set it for myself or for those who truly come. And when I cut a slice of cake or pour a second cup of tea, it is because I want to, not because I must. Sometimes I think of Daniel and Mark. I wonder if they ever replay that night in their minds, if they ever hear the echo of the words they read on that piece of paper. Perhaps they curse me. Perhaps they pity me. Perhaps they finally see me. But whatever they feel, it no longer dictates my peace. For once, their story is not my burden. What lingers instead are the voices of others. Mrs. Alvarez's steady kindness as she sat by my hospital bed, the laughter of Emily, the scholarship girl, holding that framed baseball ticket like it was a crown, the quiet murmur of neighbors who once pitied me, but now nod with respect when they see me carrying my groceries home, shoulders straight. Those voices form a new chorus in my life, one that tells me I am not invisible, not disposable, not forgotten. The steam from my tea swirls and fades, and I watch it disappear without sadness. Things come and go. Children's innocence, marriages, health, even rings of gold once slipped onto fingers. But dignity, once reclaimed, does not vanish. It lives inside me now, stronger than the pull of old habits, brighter than the shadows of past mistakes. A smile creeps onto my face, small at first, then steady. Not a smile for anyone to see or applaud, but one for myself alone. It is the smile of a woman who has walked through fire and chosen to keep walking, who has tasted bitterness but now savors sweetness, who has spent decades serving others a slice and at last sits down to enjoy the whole piece. The room is quiet, save for the ticking clock. I let it fill the space. I let it remind me that time, for all its cruelty, also heals. I am not their afterthought. I was always enough. And for the first time, I believe it. For most of my life, I spoke to rooms where no one truly listened. Tonight, I want to speak directly to you. If you have ever been left behind, if you have ever set a table and stared at empty chairs, I want you to know something important. You are not invisible. Your worth is not measured by who shows up for you, or by how loud the crowd cheers from the bleachers. Your value is not in the noise of others. It rests quietly, deeply, in you. I learned this lesson late, perhaps later than I should have, but maybe right on time. When no one came, I discovered how to come for myself. When the phone never rang, I found a silence that was not abandonment, but healing. And when my sons chose a ball game over my life, I realized that love cannot be begged or bartered. Love must be freely given. So if you are listening to me now, and you have known the sting of being overlooked, please carry this truth with you. You do not need to wait on someone else to see you, to choose you, to prove that you matter. Sometimes the most powerful choice you will ever make is to show up for yourself. If no one else comes, then come for you. I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt that same sharp edge, that same emptiness I once carried? Have you ever stood up, dusted yourself off, and whispered, "I deserve better," even when no one else agreed? If so, I want to hear from you. Tell me your story. Share how you rose, how you reclaimed your ground, how you found peace. Leave it in the comments below, because I promise you, I will read every single word with gratitude. I do not tell my story for pity. I tell it so that perhaps you will see yourself reflected in it, and in that reflection, find strength. Maybe you think I was wrong. Maybe you believe I should have forgiven more, or waited longer, or tried harder. If so, tell me that too. I can hold your thoughts with respect, because what matters most is that we talk about it, that we do not stay silent where silence breeds hurt. Before we say goodbye, let me ask, where are you listening from right now? Is it a quiet morning, a warm cup of coffee steaming beside you, the sun just breaking through your curtains? Or is it late at night, your world hushed, and stories like mine the company you keep while the rest of the house sleeps? Wherever you are, I hope you feel less alone, knowing we share this moment together. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to join us here, not just to hear more stories like mine, but to belong to a community that still believes in kindness, in healing, and in second chances. Consider subscribing, turning on the bell so you will know when another voice rises to tell a story you might need to hear. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the miracle you are waiting for is not a knock at your door, but a voice across the distance saying, "You are not forgotten." Thank you for spending your time with me today. I know how precious your time is, and it humbles me that you chose to share it here. Wherever you are, whatever stage of life you stand in, may you carry this truth with you. You are not anyone's afterthought. You are enough. Take care of yourself. And remember, if no one else comes, come for you. Sometimes the quietest acts of courage are the ones that change everything. Until the next story, I'll be here, waiting with a warm cup of tea, believing in your strength.